Hey, my name is Mo, and I'm a mostly normal guy with a very unrelated day job. I'd like to welcome you to the second episode in a series of conversations I'm hosting with key figures in the UAP disclosure space. My goal in hosting these conversations is to elevate the level of discourse, reduce the stigma associated with the topic, and provide resources that can help regular folks get up to speed without getting lost in a maelstrom of BS. In today's episode, I'll be sitting down with Nick Gold to discuss a variety of themes and initiatives relevant to the current discourse. Nick, if you're not familiar, is the founder of DeclassifyUAP, a website that makes it incredibly easy for American citizens to engage their elected officials on the UAP topic in a neutral and highly effective manner. Before we dive in, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. I don't have any inside information of any sort, nor do I have any concrete theories as to what is definitively going on. My opinion changes on a weekly basis. As new information comes out every couple of weeks and the Overton window keeps evolving so rapidly before our eyes, I think it's reasonable, if not downright rational, to expect one's opinions on the topic to oscillate wildly. What I do have, however, is a strong desire to seek the truth, plus a 6-year or so head start on trying to parse all of this. The latter is probably the only meaningful difference between you and I. With all that said, here's Nick. Alrighty, Nick, it's truly a pleasure to have you on. I know we've interacted a few times over Twitter and even on a couple of Twitter spaces in the past. But obviously, I wanted to take a little bit of extra time to chat with you, learn a little bit more about what you've been up to in the space and how you got here. And funnily enough, I'm not sure you know this, but I think DeclassifyUAP was actually launched within a week or so of DisclosureDiaries. And I have to say, it really gave me some validation at the time, because provided also just the impression that there's more people, or I would hesitate to say competent individuals, with a low tolerance for BS and a genuine interest in elevating the discourse entering the space. So that was really cool to see, and I just think it's kind of one of those funny serendipities. Before I get ahead of myself, obviously, I just want to hear a little bit more about your background and how you first got involved in the UAP topic. So let us know.
Well, thanks for having me on today, Mo. It's a real pleasure. And again, I think that's actually mutual. Between what you did with Disclosure Diaries and Declassify UAP and what Lester Nare has done with UAP Caucus and several other efforts, including some individuals like Ronak and others who just kind of started this kind of grassroots, getting people thinking about this topic in a more traditional, grounded, issue-oriented sense. It was great to see this little flurry of activity, late this summer, early this autumn, and I think it speaks to the fact that there is kind of a gelling as this issue goes and how people are relating to it, and that's what I've been trying to help spur a little bit. So this topic is one that I've just frankly been interested in for my entire life. I've said before, I'm a child of the 80s. I was in elementary school in the 80s, so we had the ETs and the Flight of the Navigators and the Return of the Jedis, and in the science fiction realm that kind of normalized in a sense this notion of UFOs, as we used to call them, and the fact that they might be here and there might be beings associated with them. And as strange as it sounds, it was like, to me, it was always like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, Earth is in space. We're just in space right now, flying around in space. Maybe space is not empty entirely of other beings or whatever, or things. So, that's not necessarily exclusively how I even think of the UAP issue, but that's kind of the realm I was immersed in from childhood. And it came very naturally to me to be open-minded towards even those possibilities, right? I started the study of this topic pretty seriously, probably not too far after that. I mean, maybe even in elementary school into junior high and high school, reading books, reading old government reports, and starting to realize pretty quickly, I mean, one thing I like to think I'm decent at is pattern recognition, especially when there's a lot of noise and still kind of, I have this approach where I like to sort of almost blur my eyes. And I feel like certain patterns can emerge more when, instead of focusing on specifics, you actually allow yourself to look at the generalities a little bit more. And to me, it just like struck me as pretty obvious that this was for real on some level. Like, people really saw these things. the government really took and takes it seriously, that was something that they were not comfortable about being totally forthright with in a public sense. These things are all quite obvious, frankly, when you look at the now almost 75 years, or really 75-year history of the government looking into this topic, from a military and intelligence standpoint. And I was like, okay, this is for real. These things probably happen.
Or at the very least, there's something to the phenomenon. It's definitely not nothing.
Yeah, no, and again, I mean, when you have like very high level credentialed people who are, employed essentially because they're pilots and can recognize things in the skies or whatever, and they're reporting things that they just know are not correlating to what makes sense. There's something probably to that. When it's, one or two, that's one thing. When it's dozens, when it's hundreds, when it's thousands, like it starts to add up. So I've had an interest in it, on and off my entire life. That interest has dovetailed with other kind of somewhat esoteric interests, some of those intersecting with the government, things like Black Project military aircraft. That's the whole realm that I've also had a lot of interest in, and again, dovetails the UAP issue on several levels. Always been interested in things like secret societies and sort of the underside of the world. And again, realms that certainly groups of people take really seriously, and there's something to it on some level, but is not widely known, isn't like widely immersed into our culture. And so I've just kind of stuck with it ever since. It's been a lifelong thing at this point. I've been even in online communities of interest around this topic since the early 1990s, before there were even web pages. I think I was probably on Usenet groups and major domo mailing lists and the things that we used to use on the internet to communicate with one another on this topic. And again, others that dovetail with it. So it's certainly changed a lot in the last few years. That's palpable as far as I can tell. There was a shift with that New York Times article. So it's kind of fun to finally feel like we're in a little bit of a new era, where instead of the same holding patterns that we've seen for, again, mostly 75 years, there's something new going on. And that's a really exciting time and something to be involved with.
Yeah, and would you say perhaps this last 5-6 years, this shift in tone has also been one of the main reasons, perhaps, that drove you to start DeclassifyUAP? Was that one of the main triggers, you think, or?
Absolutely. Like, it wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been that shift in tone. The way I look at it is, we know some of these folks pretty well at this point, the Christopher Mellons, the Lou Elizondos, the Jay Strattons, Robert Bigelows, and all of this stuff, who have had interest in this. And now we've kind of learned about what some of their interest and involvement has been, over the last 5 or 6 years. And the fact that they were kind of pushing things from the inside, right? They were insiders. They high-level intelligence officials, government officials, people like Bigelow doing, DIA contracts and stuff like that. So, a lot of them, were putting pressure on the system from the inside, or you might want to say from a top-down perspective, to kind of move this along. Especially, I think some of them were pretty frustrated that there wasn't a genuine whole of government approach to solving this. It was very compartmented, obviously, in terms of literal compartmentation, but also just as well as how it was sort of handled by the government, very, very tiny little niches. And I think a lot of them, genuinely feel, and I've had a chance to interact with a few of them over the years. They, to my mind, very genuinely feel, number one, from a just typical government, military, and intelligence operations standpoint, this isn't the right way of handling something like this. You're not necessarily going to get all the best and brightest on such a significant issue, quote unquote, problem, problem to be solved, something to be learned about, when it's just so ridiculously classified and compartmented. But I think they also genuinely feel the public has a right to know a lot more about what's going on in our natural world, and that, classifying aspects of our natural world is just a strange thing to do and not productive. So I was seeing all of that, obviously, along with everybody else, again, from this insider top-down perspective. But the thing that was catching my attention is, really, despite the fact that the public has had this inordinate interest in this topic for almost 75 years, we weren't seeing a bottom-up approach to also applying pressure on government to change the way that they relate to this issue and how they communicate about it to the U.S. people. There wasn't the red, white, and blue, civic issue website like that you've got up on the screen now, that you could go to and learn about, the topic, and have very grounded, rooted in the realms of officialdom sources of information, things that are not, going into conspiracy land. I'm fascinated with that stuff. It's interesting, but like, I don't know that normalizes it in the way that I was looking to. I just wanted a really clean, nice, approachable, kind of, again, official sources oriented website that makes a strong, firm case rooted in very grounded kind of pieces of information that allows you then to engage with this topic as a citizen. I was specifically interested, I'm an American, in US voters, for every other issue we care about, every side of every issue we care about, gun control, gun rights, pro this community, anti this community, pro environmentalism, pro, no more regulation or whatever, right? Like, for every possible standpoint and issue, you have nonprofits, think tanks, more activism oriented kind of civic engagement groups, and they have clear-cut, often calls to action for citizens, US voters. Go to our webpage, learn about it, fill out a few fields of information, click a button, and send a message to your elected officials letting them know X, Y, and Z. Make it really easy for people to begin that process of engagement, not as a one and done thing, to just start to even stimulate in people's thinking, wow, this is like a whole way I can relate to this, that I can actually have some personal agency in this issue that is normally painted as like behind every closed door. It's super classified. There's nothing I can do as an individual to move along, government UAP transparency. What can I do? Well, it's like, we can do the things we do for every other issue. Why doesn't that exist? And, if there is genuinely something to this UAP thing, how would we ever expect big movement on it to happen without the little form that you fill out and hit a button and allow people to reach out to their representatives and begin calling their office and have a call script that you can kind of have a few key talking points? Like, we do that for everything else. We do that for
exactly. I think that's the crucial point. It's just to start seeing it as just another political or political issue, if you will, that people need to get involved in. Otherwise, how can we possibly expect a politician to take any interest in it if they don't see any sort of public interest in it?
That's exactly engagement. Right. And as you said, to turn it into an issue, not just a topic of fascination or interest or obsession, as the case may be, speaking of myself and many others here, okay, it's like a hobby, it's been that for a long time. And there's been little waves of movement of civic action around it in the past, but not even really in my lifetime, frankly. I was like, it needs to just be an issue. It needs to be an issue amongst other issues. In fact, it's like, you want it to start to look like an issue that's almost more mundane, like other issues we engage around. You want to normalize it. As long as it's this giant thing of cosmic proportions that's like
out in the ether,
then it's like, well, first of all, then the government has every excuse in the world to not really push it along, because it's not in the realm of other issues that people are really paying attention to in that way and have kind of clear-cut expectations around what they want to see out of government action around that particular issue. So I almost like wanted the web page to blend in. When I was working with my web designer, a great guy named Michael Rezel, who's one of the Reddit UFOs moderators. He's less of an active moderator. He does more behind the scenes stuff with them for the most part. Very bright guy, very into the topic. Happened to know him through Reddit. And he was like, can you give me some example websites that you want to look at? I literally Googled the phrase, "let Congress know," because I had a feeling that phrase, we've all heard that in ads, issue ads, websites, whatever, let Congress and the president know. Like, it's a call to action. It's very civic engagement oriented. It's kind of promoting, like, you as a U.S. voter, as a constituent, have a role in communicating with your elected officials to tell them what you want them to do and how you want them to represent your interests, because that's kind of their job. That's why we put them in office. So, all you have to do is Google that phrase, "let Congress know," and you see a plethora of these issue websites come up. And they all had sort of similar graphical themes for the most part, mostly light colors, touches of red and blue, very kind of, red, white, and blue, kind of rah, civic, colors. A lot of them have, again, pictures of like, DC and the Capitol building and the Washington Monument. I was like, I just want a really nice version of that.
Well, I think he nailed it, or the designer nailed it, and then you nailed it as well. I think just conceptually, and just because I do think it's worth highlighting, and you mentioned it briefly, but I've pulled up the Action Center here. So do you think you could give us a quick run through of what this essentially is and what it does, what the functionality behind it is?
Absolutely. So, as when I was envisioning this website, and the vision of it was what people see here. I mean, once I had the idea sparked, and it was really a former boss who I wasn't working for at the time anymore. And he was like, Nick, you just need to do your thing and like what you want to do, and you do it. Like, you don't need any other one else's permission. You don't need a whole group to do it. You can just do what you want to do. It like all emerged like wholly in my head. Like, okay, I can like picture every like element of the nav bars and what sections are going to be there. And like a key portion of it is like, I want that little form that you see on issue websites that sort of has the pre-filled out little letter, and it allows you to fill out just a few of your own, pieces of information and hit a button. And it instantly routes that message to your own elected officials. Or if you want to have a call script and call their DC office, you hit the little phone button. And so it's funny, I have a technology background professionally. And so, I evaluate technology vendors and software vendors. It's been a big part of my career. And I was like, okay, there's got to be like vendors of that platform that you bolt onto your website that gives you or gives voters
that exact functionality. Yeah.
So I was starting to put feelers out to, who some of the leading vendors are in that space. And I found these guys called Voter Voice. They're under a larger company. They got rolled up into a company called Fiscal Note that makes a variety of software platforms that are used for like legislation management and all of this stuff. So they gobbled up these guys, Voter Voice, a number of years ago. But Voter Voice has been out for like 15, 20 years or something, because, digital grassroots advocacy has been a thing for decades now. And I was like, oh, this looks familiar. I've totally filled out forms for issues that I care about using their software before on various websites. Like, it was, the font was familiar. Everything was familiar about it. And it's really like, you need a name, you need a street address and a zip code. And that's all you really need, because it uses those pieces of information, because it only routes voters' messages to their own elected officials. And that's kind of at the heart of at least what DeclassifyUAP is trying to do. It's that voice of the constituent that's a particularly loud voice with our elected officials. Like, they do at the end of the day understand that their job is to represent their constituents' interests.
They take notice. Yeah.
And and people need to remember, it's technically not the job of a House rep in California to really care about what someone in Connecticut thinks or someone in Texas. It's that person's job is to represent the people in their congressional district, if they're a House member, their state, if they're one of the two senators that represents a state. And that's what they're wired to pay attention to. So this platform does need a few pieces of information in order to do that routing at the end of the day. That's really the only reason we have to collect that information at all for the Voter Voice platform. No. Because those elected officials' offices that have mechanisms for kind of ingesting electronic messages that are sent to them, they don't allow any old person in the world, in the United States, to send electronic messages. They need some form of validation that this is actually a constituent that's reaching out through that mechanism. Voter Voice respects that. Voter Voice knows that their messages will get rejected if they start passing a bunch of messages from non-constituents, and they don't want to be blocked. Yeah. So it just makes it so trivial. It's like a less than 30-second process, and someone can be like, I just sent a nice little list. And I have it so it's only the pre-filled out message. I was a little worried about people messing with the system. It's an area that attracts all sorts of people who are both believers, debunkers. So I decided we're going to have that pre-filled out message that you send when you go to the DeclassifyUAP Action Center. It's just declassifyuap.org/action takes you there. I want it to be completely filled out already. And that message, which I, crafted down to the last character that they allow you, because there's certain message limit lengths, and some congressional offices have different lengths than the others. So, you're kind of going to the least common denominator. I was like, I want essentially to create a checklist for the constituent. I want them to send a list of what we call the declassification targets, which outlines the exact kinds of information we're looking to have declassified on the UAP subject. And I want each of those to at least succinctly be spoken to. And then I want a few other statements about what that constituent is looking for out of their representative as it relates to UAP transparency and declassification. So they can be sure they've sent a pretty comprehensive list that gets all of the main points out there in as little amount of time as possible associated with their name and address as a constituent. But then it also sort of serves as like a checklist for them, because as they start getting correspondence back from their representatives' offices, if they make a call to DC and ask specific questions, they can kind of look at that original letter that they sent through the Action Center and be like, did that get actually answered or addressed directly? Did that get answered directly? Did they actually mention that at all? And unfortunately, a lot of messages that people get back at this point are pretty fluffy if they get one at all.
Boilerplate, yeah.
But it's like, that's to be expected. This isn't about, it's not about being validated. It's not about having someone on the internet give you a like or your congressman giving you a like. I mean, not to diss people, but there is a lot of that in our culture right now where people kind of want that little like ding of internet validation. And it's not about that. Like, we're writing these letters because it's not at the right point today. Like, we have to do the work before those responses start getting better. But when you send them a list of very specific items and then say you call back their DC office in a week and you say, I never heard back about these points. Like, let's go over these, especially this one right now. Like, can you commit that you are supportive of the UAP Disclosure Act being in the FY24 National Defense Authorization Act? It allows someone to start to exert pressure in a more concerted way, in a more specific way, that I think leads to actual outcomes. Because if you just ask someone, do you support UAP, transparency, they're going to be like, yeah, vote for me next time. But if you start asking, like, give me a yes or no on your support of the UAPDA that's up for a vote now, it's leverage. It forces them to have to start to evolve their own messaging and what they actually support as a representative. And frankly, it educates them, because we can't.
Exactly. I think that's the key. It puts it on their desk, right?
These reps, we know more about this issue than most of these reps. We really
and
do.
That's only normal and to be expected. And it's just our role as an active citizen is to put some sort of information on their desk that allows them to then serve us better. That's the entire point.
Exactly right. And that's the role we have. And that's a very valuable role that any individual now, a US voter, in terms of DeclassifyUAP, can be part of. Like, we have to be those agents of change. And, I just, again, wanted to put a tool out there that makes that as easy as possible for people to start to engage with.
And something else I just wanted to highlight is, I think, while you've spelled out some pretty specific kind of declassification targets, which I'll pull up on the screen in a second, I also think the message you wrote ultimately is something that, whether you're a skeptic or a neutral or a believer, it's something I think all of them can stand behind. And I think that's something that I really appreciate both from you and Lester Nare. It's there's no dogma whether you have your personal beliefs or not. It's just, hey, there's clearly something here that needs to be addressed. And here are some cogent ways to go about it. And I think that's ultimately going to be the key to getting also a critical mass of the public engaged as well.
That was very deliberate. And when I was writing all the copy, and I think I wrote every word on that entire website in several frenetic 15-hour all-nighter sessions over the course of like a week and a half when I was building the website out. There's been many tweaks and everything, but again, I sort of was like channeling the website. I knew exactly what I wanted it to be, and the fingers were just kind of waving over the keyboard. But in the back of my head throughout all of it, and how this got communicated, the imagery, the words, like everything in it, the message, just all of the copy on the website, I was thinking about people like Mick West, or Michael Shermer of Skeptic Magazine, and not thinking that they would necessarily be supportive of the effort individually or even that type of individual. But I wanted that skeptical voice to be one that at least theoretically could get on board, that I wasn't saying anything that goes really beyond what the government has told the public in very official settings at this point. And, I was like, I don't want to turn off skeptics. In fact, I should think that skeptics or people who are just a little more critical of this topic should want more official information to come out on it as much as anyone.
Agreed.
They're sick of the little endless stream of photographs of dots on the internet that people post and say, I think I saw a UFO, that just are never going to be credible in and of themselves. They can't validate anything. Like, I should think that the skeptics are first in line to wanting like the clear 30-second video of something that clearly is looking like a UFO and it's doing weird stuff, and it's like, yeah, that's not a lens flare, that's not a cloud, that's not a reflection,
or even if it is, you would want a clarification as to why certain officials refuse to admit that that might be the case, or why they insist that these are UAP, and why they insist on using tax dollars to keep looking into this over the years. Again, these are, if I were a hardcore skeptic and or debunker, I would be just as fervent in my desire to get to the bottom of what the hell is going on here.
Are you wasting my tax money? Are you gaslighting the public that there even is a phenomenon going on here?
So
is this a psyop? And I think people have a very good reason to think that when the lead communications person on the UAP issue is a career psyop officer. That's what her whole job is.
I'm sure that's just a coincidence.
Oh, but, yeah, of course. That had nothing to do with it. I think, frankly, putting someone in that role that so blatantly was of that realm is another layer of that, to just cause question and make people think, oh, this is all bullshit, or this is all a psyop or whatever. But regardless, it's like, yeah, like I would want to know if this is all some big game that we've been getting played with. And that's one of the declassification targets that we call out. We want to know whether there has been kind of information management around this topic, in addition to more concrete pieces of evidence. But it is important to know, what have we been told that's accurate? What have we been told that's not accurate? Has there been kind of a narrative that's been getting pushed for a particular reason that may or may not correlate to an underlying reality to this phenomenon, or at least as people understand that? So yeah, we wanted to make these declassification targets just really clear and called out, and I wanted to make a case for them. So on this page, you see that in addition to saying what we're looking for, there's kind of a case that's made as to why that's probably a reasonable thing to expect that we should be able to get out of them at this point.
Yeah. No, I'd love for you to just take us through them. I think there's 6. Is that correct?
I think it's 7 total. We have recorded media. This is the one that everyone has probably on top of their list. It's like, we know that they give us these photographs or the gun camera footage of Chinese jets dropping flares or almost colliding with our spy airplanes or fighter jets, or the Chinese balloon. You have
even this month, I think there was 15 incidents. Yeah, of Chinese jets. And
one of the ones where a Chinese fighter came within literally feet of a surveillance aircraft, probably, that I think was operated by Canada. There was actually like a reporter on the plane at the time, and they were losing it. They had this they call it like an aggressive, unprofessional intercept, because nations' aircraft intercept each other all the time, even over international airspace, typically is where it's happening. And so this craft was in international airspace that China is making some pretty strange claims over. And so they are starting to fly their fighter jets, within feet of some of our own aircraft. And people might remember, I think it was like 10 or 15 years ago, there was actually a collision, and one of our craft had to land, and it was a real mess, diplomatically, and even just for the individuals involved. And so this one that happened just a handful of days ago, this Chinese jet came within feet of the surveillance aircraft. And we, the public, on the news, on the internet, got this crystal clear, like high definition video footage. By the way, with all of the metadata on screen
Yep.
overlays, everything. I didn't think anything was grayed out. It had all the numbers and digits and and we saw every last detail of that incident within like a day or two of it occurring. And we're often told, sources and methods. We can't give you the quality of the footage that we're able to shoot out of our aircraft. That would give away too much information. We can't show you the metadata that's on screen because it would give too much operational information about what's going on. And the reality is those are lies. Those are, as far as I'm concerned, those are just lies.
Or there's a glaring inconsistency at the very least. It can't. How can it be?
You can say that. I'm going to say they're lies. I'm going to just say that. So, because again, we have all of these examples that we can draw on, and so
Exactly.
recorded media is one of them. The next area is to actually just start to describe in more detail the characteristics and capabilities of these things that remain unresolved in government ease, things like the Tic-Tac, or these other things that look a certain way and then aren't behaving in a way that seems to correlate with what it appears to be capable of. If it's a metal sphere and then suddenly it's going Mach 2 without any thermal exhaust detected, that's highly anomalous. Or frankly, even a little sphere that's just moving against the wind and doesn't have any means of propulsion. Like the moment it's either hovering in high winds or slightly moving against the wind, it instantly becomes highly anomalous, even if it's not doing Tic-Tac type stuff. So, the reality is the government has all of these, platforms that are looking at space in a lot of detail, really out to the diameter of where the moon is. Within that range, we see a lot of stuff based on the radar systems and whatnot that we have. We also have things under the ocean. They're looking for submarines. They're looking for the so-called boomers, the Russian nuke subs and whatever. And these space and undersea monitoring platforms are some of the most classified intelligence platforms that we have right now. And sorry, I live in Baltimore. There's a helicopter going by, so I don't know if you can hear that. I'm being monitored right now, right? No, very, very common occurrence in Baltimore City. So, we have gotten the government to describe not the details of what these systems are capable of observing, not the raw data that comes off of them. Of course, that's very sensitive, classified information. And I have a lot of respect for that. I've done some government work in my time, and I have respect for the people in that realm. I have a lot of respect for national security. I'm not an anti-intelligence community type person at all, frankly. That's just not how I'm wired. Ever since I was a little kid, I just always had a lot of respect for people in our armed forces, people in the intelligence community. I'm wired to have respect for that, even knowing that they often do some really messed up stuff. But I still respect those institutions and many of the individuals. So I understand why we can't give raw data off of the thing that's looking for nuclear, missile subs in the bottom of the ocean. But they have described in somewhat certain terms, at least what is derived out of those capabilities. For instance, Avi Loeb from Harvard and the Galileo project, had this potential interstellar meteorite that landed in, outside of Papua New Guinea. And one of the kind of confirmations that the fact that looked like an interstellar meteorite, not just something that was from within our solar system, is because Space Force, or whatever agency it is that runs this space monitoring platform, was able to basically send him a letter and said, yeah, we can't tell you any of the details, but based on what we saw, indeed, that looked like a trajectory that was from an interstellar object at these velocities and not just a typical meteorite. Likewise, when that very sad occurrence of the Titan sub imploded, on its little kind of search for just the adventure tourism that they were kind of doing for the Titanic, and there was an implosion, the government confirmed that their undersea monitoring systems heard that implosion when that vehicle, had a catastrophic failure. So, it at least starts to tell us about what these platforms are capable of defining. And so, people don't really remember this. Last year, Scott Bray, the Deputy Director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, was in a House hearing on UAP. And he basically said, he thought everyone was quite familiar with the Tic-Tac incident and its dynamics. He said, we have data on that, and it remains unresolved. The question was actually, have you seen aliens or NHI? And, seems like when they call something unresolved, they at least are implying that that's a possibility for that class of incidents. Well, he said they have the data. Can we get a brief summary of, indeed, we saw that this object was in this location, ended up in this location, this was the amount of time, and it seems to indicate that the top speed was this?
And we can confirm, for example, a physical object. We can confirm velocities. We can confirm positions, potentially
This
even
was not
multiple
radar
objects.
spoofing. This was not a glint off of a windshield. This was not a case of 4 F-18 pilots being mistaken about what they saw. Like, we can confirm X, Y, and Z. So that's an example of something that we're looking for. You'll have to remind me what the next one is by scrolling. I don't remember the exact order. Oh, this is a huge one. So again, I said, Scott Bray said, well, it's unresolved. And we have this guy, Dr. K, as I like to call him, Sean Kirkpatrick, a complex character. I don't have black and white feelings about Sean Kirkpatrick, to be frank with you. I think this whole topic and the people around it, it's much more nuanced.
It's part and parcel of the topic.
One of the things I really appreciate about him is that he actually has used some of the opportunities he's had in front of the public and in front of Congress to speak to what it really takes to scientifically validate something as kind of paradigm altering as like, yeah, we think this was from an extraterrestrial civilization, or we think this is non-human intelligence. It's a very high bar. Like, when I was part of the Galileo project, or through my current, endeavors that, I work with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, I have this pleasure of having, gotten to work with a number of very brilliant scientists, engineers, professionals who think about what does it take to validate UAP scientifically, and especially to validate them as something like extraterrestrial origin. People don't realize it's a really, really high bar. I mean, you could validate that something totally UFO-like is zipping around in our atmosphere, and that doesn't necessarily give you any specific evidence that it's extraterrestrial in origin. That might be a good hypothesis, though. But that emphasis of Sean Kirkpatrick's on what it takes to validate things scientifically, and what allows the DoD to say things like, we have no firm validation scientifically that these are extraterrestrial or whatever. People forget that scientifically validating things is not the key job of the intelligence community. The main product that's generated by our intelligence community, the main output that they create, are intelligence assessments. And an intelligence assessment can be, we have low probability feeling that this is the case. We feel medium that this is what's going on. We feel very strongly that this is probably the case. These are the 3 things that we think it might be, and here's different levels of certainty we have about those different scenarios. It's simply not a scientific level of validation that's required for generating the main thing that the intelligence community generates, which are intelligence assessments. So this is something they just don't want to talk about. And again, I feel pretty firmly like if they can validate that they have these Tic-Tac things flying around, their carrier strike groups and their F-18s, someone, somewhere, maybe multiple groups at multiple times, have assembled intelligence assessments on what that represented. Doesn't mean that they thought for sure that that's what it was. Doesn't mean that they didn't even present multiple options for what they think that was. That, it's just based on what we have, we think these things are within the realm of possibility, and this is our certainty level with these scenarios. But they don't want to talk about this. I strongly feel that very likely for some of these, especially particularly outlier events like the Tic-Tac, and again, Scott Bray did instantly go to the Tic-Tac when asked a question about aliens and NHI. He didn't miss a beat. He's like, well, I think everyone is familiar with the Tic-Tac incident. And I mean, so clearly someone at these agencies, to my mind, again, taking that kind of blur your vision and look for the patterns approach, probably has an intelligence assessment that's been written up that says, these ET or extra, NHI, this is at least in the realm of possibility. And I think the public has a right to know that the government might think, if they do, that some of these events might correlate with those types of scenarios. And they don't even have to be sure about it. They don't have to be scientifically proven about it. I just heard things about intelligence assessments relating to this war in Israel and Gaza, on TV the other day. We hear about intelligence assessments all the time when it relates to more mundane issues, and they're sometimes willing to share these. The lab leak versus the wet market, origin theories for COVID. We've gotten reports released to the public that talk about actual intelligence community intelligence assessments and their level of certainty on those things, including we're not very certain. So,
and I think that's actually a good point. Is they don't necessarily have to tell us with high confidence, or we can't expect them to tell us with high confidence what they know it is, because they probably don't know what it is, or at least that's what they keep repeating. But they could at least, for example, give us an insight into how they've come to the understanding that it cannot be prosaically explained, for example.
Exactly.
So we can at least take some things off the table, and perhaps open the avenues for scientific research, to better understand the cases that are really beyond at least the intelligence community's ability to assess things.
Well, and you just mentioned something really important, which is that if we were to learn that the government, some very bright people in the IC say, think that it's at least in the realm of possibility that some of these more paradigm shifting scenarios, as I like to think of them, might be on the table. God, think about what that might stimulate in terms of just more general scientific funding for the investigation of this topic. It starts to validate for other organizations, other institutions, academia, scientists, like, I guess there is something to this, and maybe we ought to study it like we study other things, including things that we don't even know they're out there. We have these billion-dollar gravity wave detectors, or, neutrino detectors that we build way underground. Like, if we are willing to throw billions at particle colliders for maybe getting an answer about what the next layer down of subatomic particles is, it's like that kind of an intelligence assessment might spur almost a renaissance in scientific investigation of this. And it doesn't have to be certain, because many scientific efforts aren't based on certainties. But
of course, they can't possibly be. Yeah.
There's at least a certain level of validation that starts to open up, funding sources. So the next one is this whole notion of, have there been retrievals? We've heard these allegations, frankly, for many decades. It's not just David Grush. There was Philip Corso, who wrote The Day After Roswell. There's been many others. The way I look at it is, if things are flying around in the atmosphere, there's this thing called entropy. And I doubt anyone can fully escape from the law of entropy. Like, what goes up must come down is sort of the phrase, right? So again, on a personal level, I don't have a hard time believing that if these things are up there, like, maybe there's one in like an Indiana Jones warehouse somewhere too. So I think that's important for people to know. These allegations have been levied in now, under oath, House hearings. I was lucky to be able to make it into the July 26th hearing in the room with these guys. I was 10, 12 feet behind Dave Fravor. You see my goofy little head, over his shoulder on some of the camera shots from that day. And I'm just grinning like an idiot, because I was like, I can't believe I got into here and I'm witnessing this event. It was pretty amazing. So, those are pretty major allegations. That speaks to there being a sort of deeper layer to the government's involvement with this. I think of kind of OSAP, ATIP, AOMSIG, UAP Task Force, AARO realm from 2007 onwards as sort of the outer layer of the government's involvement. This is a question more about that purported deeper layer, the so-called
long-standing legacy program,
as people call it, right? Is there an older classified, code word protected program that might be spread across a bunch of SAPs, might not be running, fully how most of these programs tend to get run, even the unacknowledged SAPs. We should know if the government has one of these. Again, if there is some dangerous technological component like there is to nuclear energy, do I think that the government, the people should have every last detail in that so we can build our own UFOs at home in our garage? No. Just like I don't think, we should be able to do that with, nuclear weapons. But, we do have mechanisms to protect those technologies, both on the national and international levels. So I do think you could acknowledge that these things physically exist and might even have exotic energy sources if that ends up being the case. And you can give that information without having to give, the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. So, learning whether we've actually got some of these, that starts to open up a lot more questions if the answer is yes to that, because that then starts to give folks physical objects that certain types of evaluations can be conducted on. Are there isotopes that seem to indicate that this is not from Earth, necessarily, or it would have had to be engineered? Are there signs of any technologies associated with these objects that just we have no means of replicating or even potentially understanding? So, the recovery thing is a big one of them.
Yeah, and I think we've reached a point where, while as you mentioned, this is not necessarily a new allegation. It's gotten to a point where we've had someone come under oath in front of Congress, and to my understanding, provide, at least he's alleged to have provided, the sort of trail, if you will, in order to falsify and or confirm the existence of these programs. So we're talking names, we're talking locations, we're talking first-hand witnesses, hostile and non-cooperative.
Well, and there's another aspect, and I just want to point this out because it's not one most people really know a lot about if they haven't touched that realm or had any participation in it. So when you go above, so-called above top secret, there's not literally something that I know of and that most people would know of that's above top secret. But there is a thing called top secret SCI, which is where you start to get into compartmented programs. And these are basically what we would call maybe code words that are themselves classified, like this phrase, this simple string of digits or letters or whatever, is itself classified and kind of has embodied within it reference to a realm of additionally classified information that's associated with that code word. So like even someone like Grush being able to relay a code word itself is a very powerful thing for investigators because it starts to be like the thing you can hunt for.
It's a thread you can pull on. Yeah,
it's exactly right. So if he's given them code words and names and locations, like that's a lot that they have to work with right now.
Yeah,
this is a big one, of course, because UAP-related public influence campaigns, which would include PSYOP elements, psychological operations, public relations, so to speak, on the issue, but a much more aggressive form of that's typically reserved for enemies when we're in a state of war, or at least clearly adversarial relationships. I think a lot of people rightly are concerned, again, especially when a career PSYOP officer is the exclusive UAP spokesperson for the DoD. Nothing against her personally, but like that waves some red flags in my book.
And again, there's plenty of, as you said, there's legitimate reasons to engage in PSYOPs, absolutely, especially with some sort of adversary.
One thing I feel strongly about, and I've talked to people even online who were in the military and involved with PSYOP, they don't generally feel it's an appropriate mechanism to communicate with the American public because it's very aggressive. It's there for a very particular set of agenda. It's no holds barred. Like it's basically do whatever. Again, Susan Goff, who is the DoD UAP spokesperson right now, pretty much any statement coming out of DoD relating to UAP that isn't just directly coming from someone like Kirkpatrick is basically coming out of her. And she has some very public on-the-record papers that she's written over the years on PSYOP, and she has a very strong view of it, I'd say. I mean, she's made the argument that PSYOP should go further than it traditionally has. It needs to plug into the emotions of the target group. I believe she's talked about how PSYOP approaches should be incorporated into domestic communications through, Office of Public Information at DoD and things like that. And so I think people have a very legitimate reason to be concerned that PSYOP is at least somehow wrapped around this. To what end? What agenda?
To what degree? Yeah.
Very hard to say. I have no ultimate ideas about that. Frankly, something people need to be aware of is that PSYOP is often not even necessarily to plant a particular narrative in someone's head or to give them a specific idea. There's an approach, a very good documentary that I recommend all the time to people, made by the British documentarian Adam Curtis. It's called Hypernormalization. Most territories, I think you can watch it on YouTube. It's a very important film, Hypernormalization, because he talks about how often propaganda's aim is not to, again, give us a specific idea that's false. It's to actually degrade our ability to either know truth, to believe that truth is discoverable, or that there even fundamentally is such a thing, truth. Like, it might throw many different competing ideas at us just to create a very mushed up landscape in our head where we're like, who could possibly figure this out? And I look at UAP realm, UFO world, as I like to call it, over decades and decades now. And, you can kind of squint your eyes and say, maybe the reason there's so many of these strong competing ideas that really tap into people's emotions, but then kind of at the end of the day, just making us wave our arms in the air and say, there's no way we can ever figure this out. Maybe hypernormalization is what's at play. So, I give examples of the US Republic, unfortunately, in the realms of officialdom, through the military, through the
It's quite a track record. Yeah.
We've done some awful shit, and we've done some really nasty things both to foreign people, and we've done really nasty stuff to our own people as well through MK Ultra, or lying to us about why we should get involved in the Iraq War, which was just all based on falsehoods. Whether they were deliberate or kind of emphasized because people wanted to believe in them, it's hard to say. But we've basically learned many times that the U.S. government has lied to us and has presented falsehoods as truth, or at least tried to dissuade us from knowing what the actual truth is behind something. And it's awful. It always is very painful to learn about. Again, I mentioned earlier, I'm just sort of naturally wired to have respect for people in our armed forces. I have respect for institutions. I've done a little bit in that realm just through some of my professional career, nothing major or anything, but there's real people there and they take their jobs really seriously, and most of them are super patriotic, and I really respect that. So it's really painful when you learn that those types of institutions and the individuals within them sometimes really, really mess up. I mean, really mess up, like major wars kind of mess up. And so that's tough. But you know what? We've survived it. We've survived it a number of times learning about it. I think the Republic grows stronger when we acknowledge that these things have occurred and it comes out and people become more informed about it, and so that we can hopefully prevent it moving forward. So if there has been a cover-up, if there's been PSYOP, if there's been information management around this topic, even aimed at Americans, and even if that uncovers some really unsavory stuff over the years, I strongly believe not only can we take it and the Republic isn't going to collapse, but shining a light on things is you heal when you shine the light on it, so to speak.
It's the first step. Yeah, it's the very first step, right?
We need to rip that Band-Aid off and just kind of get into it. So the last two are a little more grounded in specific incidents. Many people remember this very strange 3 days in a row in February of this year, where the U.S. government was suddenly deciding to take pot shots at UAP in the wake of having shot down the Chinese spy balloon. The story is that NORAD, because of the Chinese spy balloon, realized they might have some gaps in how they analyze their data, their radar data, at certain altitudes for objects of maybe certain sizes or certain air speeds. The slower, higher things, above where traditional even jet aircraft are flying, was a little bit of gap of domain awareness. And so they, changed their filters. They made sure they weren't filtering as much out. Again, this is the story anyway, but I find it somewhat believable. And suddenly more things were popping up on their radar. Maybe things that they always knew would pop up on the radar if they didn't have the filter set that way, and they just realized they weren't typically enough of a threat, and so they wanted to not make them a distraction. But suddenly in the wake of the Chinese spy balloon, they realized maybe we do need to be watching that area a little more closely. Again, I don't know for sure that that's accurate, but then we just started blasting things out of the sky 3 days in a row. We got very strange, incongruent answers from officials on it. The head of NORAD, who ran the 3 shootdown operations, the DoD had a mid-Super Bowl press conference. It was literally like in the second quarter, I believe, of the Super Bowl. And they run, a press conference on this situation of, for the first time in NORAD's history, blowing objects
shooting down over the domestic United States.
And he said some weird stuff. He refused to take ET off the table as a possible explanation for this when asked by the lead defense reporter from the New York Times, Helene Cooper.
Which seems like, in theory, the easiest question to answer, right? If you're part of the...
And it speaks, to me it says, and he said some other things along these lines, that heavily implied these were not all just balloons. Now, there were 3 events, and people conflated them, and people kind of forgot in their head how many of these events there were, and that explaining one does not mean the other 2 are explained. And frankly, none of the 3 ever got fully explained or resolved.
There's to date been no official update, no recovery, or at least they've no admittal of any recovery, despite ongoing efforts.
And yet, a memo came out of Canada that was declassified that seemed to indicate that indeed at least one of the objects had been recovered and had begun a process of what they call exploitation, or what they did with the Chinese balloon. We have to go through every little piece of it that we found. We got to figure out what it does, how it all adds together, like what's the capabilities behind the system, how does it work, what was it trying to do based on what we can evaluate and that's sitting in front of us. And that Canadian memo, because 2 of these incidents involved Canadian airspace quite heavily. Maybe even the first one over Canada at one point might have been in Canadian airspace. It's like, that's incongruent with the official story we were told. Like, that's a document that seems to imply that at least one of those 3 objects was indeed recovered, and they told us it wasn't. So we want to know more about what was happening with those incidents. And then the last one, I think it's probably the most compelling UFO case in history at this point, is the Tic-Tac.
Or at least the most compelling, publicly known, perhaps, is the.
Oh, yeah, that's what I mean. Yes, certainly. Yeah. That between the number of pilots who have confirmed it and who have in detail relayed their narrative account of that experience, Kevin Day and other radar operators from the Princeton and the entire carrier strike group, who for weeks were seeing strange things, including on that day that they saw the Tic-Tac object. The FLIR video that we have of the Tic-Tac object, there's more data that we've actually seen on that incident than pretty much any other UFO case. And it was compelling. Like, the story that Fravor and Dietrich and the others tell is like, yeah, that's like a typical UFO doing UFO type stuff without any visible flight control surfaces, no obvious mechanisms of lift or thrust. It's basically a capsule, maybe with these 2 little legs off the bottom, which is strange, but that's a UFO by anyone's definition. And it was confirmed by Scott Gray that we kind of understand the dynamics of what was said. He seemed to confirm that, like, the story that we heard from Fravor and others was what happened, and they have
essentially
data.
Correct. Yeah.
So, well, tell us more. What's the intelligence assessment on what that was? Can you give us any, again, summary of what radar data confirmed? We know it was in this location, and it probably moved at this speed to this location. Now, SCU and other independent research groups have done analysis, and it's like, based on how quickly it zipped away from Fravor and how quickly it appeared at the so-called cap, or kind of rally point for the fighter aircraft, ranges of Mach 40 to Mach 50 from a near hover to that speed, and then achieving a near hover at its destination with like Mach 40 to Mach 50 in between. I'm sorry. People can, make claims about secret capabilities and programs and reverse engineered X, Y, and Z and whatever. There's no actual evidence that humans have the capability of building something like that. There's nothing out there that even slightly indicates that we can do that. Our objects would tear themselves apart in a second just doing that. Like, the metal would fall apart. It would pulverize. You forget about pilots. Things can be remotely piloted, whatever. That's not a problem. But like, the object itself, we couldn't build something that holds together at all.
Our material science just isn't at that point. Or any indications we see in the private markets and the commercial markets don't indicate any sort of.
Doesn't make sense. So if the Navy could say we can confirm that object went from a near hover to about Mach 40 or Mach 50 and then arrived at a near hover, and that's all they said. They don't give us the data. They don't give us the sensor information. They don't tell us how they derive that information. But again, like the letter to Avi Loeb about the space observations, or like the note that they gave us about that Titan sub, just explain what you heard and at least give us that morsel so people can be like, okay, Navy confirmed that the Tic-Tac went Mach 40. That's crazy, and it gives us another very compelling data point. So these are the declassification targets, and every letter that someone sends through DeclassifyUAP.org/action calls out in summarized form each of them, in addition to several other asks about legislation and supporting whistleblowers and things like that. Because we need to be specific. We can't just say, do you support UAP transparency? Any politician can say yes to that. or they can just avoid it. But we can now say, have I gotten the high quality recorded media? Have we gotten intelligence assessments? Have we gotten more information on the February shootdowns? We need to make these specific asks, and then as we don't get them, ask again and again and again
Follow
and again
up,
until we start filling out that list.
Yeah, no, amazing initiative, and I'll obviously be linking to it any chance I get. While you're here, I also just quickly wanted to pick your brain about something fairly exciting, or at least it was billed to be quite exciting, that happened about 4 hours ago, I believe, which was I think members of the House Oversight Committee were invited, or perhaps requested, to have a classified briefing with the DoD Inspector General to discuss UAP-related matters.
Yep.
And just as a little bit of context, David Grush is at least one whistleblower that we know of who made a classified filing to the DoD IG back in 2021, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
So obviously hopes were high to get some more information. I think we've already heard some statements from Congressman Tim Burchett and Anna Paulina Luna to suggest that, in their words, essentially nothing new or nothing at all came from this session. So I wanted to just pick your brain and hear your thoughts about what the public can expect to hear from these kind of sessions.
I think they're very important, and I spent yesterday calling members of that committee and suggesting that they go, and some were very responsive, and I think there's a lot of genuine interest on the Hill to keep exploring this. It's a very important thing, as will be in November the ICIG briefing. Very different responses. AOC was there, and I was very glad to see that she followed up from the July hearing and actually put her time and energy into being there. That's fantastic, because we want people from all parties of all different mental orientations to be attacking this in Congress. So AOC just said classified, like when she was asked what came of it or what did you learn. And that's the appropriate response, frankly, because classified information is classified. Even hinting at what you learned, whatever is not appropriate, probably not accurate. Again, I had a clearance at one point, like, you just don't talk about it. It's just classified. So I think Representative Luna, or Anna Paulina Luna's statement, was interesting. We have to parse these things. People need to think a little bit harder. She said nothing new was revealed. But the question is, did we need explicitly something new to be revealed in that hearing? Or, because what it's about is confirming what's already been alleged. Like, if you take for granted that aliens are running around planet Earth and you expect, Jaime Maussan to wheel out bodies and that's your bar for something new, then yeah, you'll probably be disappointed. And, I don't know how useful that even would be. But if, we don't know what was said. But if any element of what Grush said and alleged in an unclassified hearing was confirmed to any degree in a classified setting with some actual information behind it, that's a huge step forward. We won't know that. The reality is we're not going to know that. And the moment any rep starts to be more specific about it, which they won't, because they can get in big, big trouble for that.
And go to jail, yeah.
So, and it's weird. House members and elected officials have a little more leeway with this than some other folks, even in terms of what they say. But they're not going to just drop classified information on the table. But we need to be very discriminating in even how any rep speaks about this issue. We don't need, in one fell swoop, the government to wheel out the bodies or take them into the warehouse with the recovered UFO and say, yep, it's aliens. Like, that's not realistic. That's not how processes like this unfold. What we need is to be making concrete steps forward for members of Congress, the legislative branch, which seems to have been largely cut out of the UAP issue for decades and decades and decades. I think there's a bit of I call it a crypto-constitutional crisis that's been going on, because I have the impression that the executive branch, the DoD, the IC, and maybe up to POTUS, has kind of bogarted this information for maybe decades, clearly has not shared it with the legislative branch in the way that they're kind of supposed to, at least with the Gang of Eight. So it's good that members of Congress are putting their time and energy into this. It's good that they're taking it seriously. It's good that there's DoD and ICIG investigations. It's good that they're being given the opportunity to start to interface with those offices to get updates, even if it's pretty mundane stuff, even if it's not new territory. it still can push the ball down the field in a very meaningful way. And so we got to support these efforts in an ongoing way. We can't get, throw our arms up in the air and wave around and say, it's hopeless, nothing's ever going to happen. The secret conspiracy of the secret government is never going to let this out. The defense contractors are never going to let this out. I don't believe that, first of all. And I think taking these types, you just want to move the ball down the field. And that's been happening consistently. And I have to remind people of this. Despite its problems, despite my own frustrations with it, despite many people's frustrations, AARO has technically moved the ball down the field in the several years it's been operating. We got a UAP data slide that confirmed that the things people think of when they think of UAP is what their target package is, as Kirkpatrick described it. That's huge. The fact that they even confirmed what the shapes of the things are.
The morphologies, the speeds.
They go to Mach 2. They don't show thermal exhaust. Oh, look, they even acknowledge they get radio transmissions from some of them. These things are putting out
the global nature. Another very, very interesting statement about that. Seeing them all around the world, I believe, something along those lines.
We're getting normalized through these little baby steps, and I see that as progress. Everyone wants it all at once, but, I have big concerns about some of the strange things that appear in AARO's materials. Why are they picking Adobe stock images of, ET technology orb and then splitting it into quarters? And, what the hell is that? That's ridiculous. That's playing games with the public that just is silly. Grow up already. Why is there a glossary in this report that came out a week ago that has all of these bizarre terms that seem to imply recovered objects and, even biological
UAP
materials?
threat, yeah.
All of this stuff, terms that weren't even in the unclassified report. It's not a mistake that those things show up in the glossary. There's a reason behind it, but I can't say what that reason firmly is. But again, it feels a bit like some gaslighting or some playing of games. Or maybe it's a very drip, drip, drip kind of normalization. I don't know. But, I want the office to not be doing that in such an obfuscated way. Yet they have moved the ball down the field. They've confirmed that this is real. They've put out some of the characteristics of at least a lot of the type of UAP that they're spotting, which is very strange stuff according to their own materials. So we got to be willing to be in this for the long game. Any kind of activism, any kind of civic movement, any kind of civic engagement for a big issue. It could be the environment. It could be something like gun laws, because that's baked into our Constitution. It's a big deal for Americans. These big things take time. They have to be sustained efforts. And we have to be willing to really pay attention to just whether the ball is moving down the field in the right direction. I will be satisfied with my own time and energy and monies and everything put into the Declassify UAP effort if the ball keeps moving down the field. That's the main thing I'm looking for right now.
Yeah, no, completely agreed. And I think, honestly, Declassify UAP is probably one of the better resources to contribute to that. And I hope anyone listening to this goes and checks it out and
much appreciated.
Bookmarks it and hopefully just starts to at least get involved and get active. And as we've mentioned before, it's not about subscribing to any sort of particular end point or end station of this process. It's just ensuring, as you just said, the process actually keeps moving.
And it doesn't even have to be a full-time thing. If people are into UFOs, want to put their time into the mummies, the Nazca mummies, or the Calvine photo, or whatever it might be, that's fine. Carve off 10 to 15 minutes a month where you shoot an email to your rep or you make a few calls to the DC offices. They take 2.5 minutes to call the DC office and say, hey, I haven't seen this. I really like this. What's your stance on the UAP Disclosure Act? If you do that once every month or two and you take that 10 or 15 minutes out of the hours and hours you put into this issue and you say, okay, this is my little allotted time for my UAP interest to be manifested in civic engagement, that alone will make so much of an impact.
Agreed. Nick, we're almost at the end of this conversation, unfortunately. I just wanted to ask you one last completely or somewhat unrelated question, and it has to do with your background. So I've seen quite a book collection, and I wonder if you have any recommendations. Anytime I figure someone's a bookworm, I always like to get a couple new names from my list, and it doesn't have to be anything specific to this topic or anything that you think will have all the answers, but from the view of maybe expanding horizons, what would be your maybe one or two or three recommendations?
Wow, I could go in so many directions with that. And this is not the only bookshelf in this house. There's the one there, there's one there, there's the downstairs, there's the rich media collection, the DVDs and Blu-rays. What I would say is, again, I could go in so many directions. So I've also been very interested in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I've also had a very intense interest ever since elementary school, like what the F is going on? What's the fundamental nature of reality? Like what's going on with everything? Like I always really want to get into that. And there is a lot of this consciousness conversation around the UAP topic. Like there's a consciousness angle. Well, I personally think it goes a lot deeper than that, this consciousness thing. I would recommend, it's not to like say you have to have a religious belief or a spiritual belief. It's frankly a work of philosophy, and it's poetic philosophy, and it's absolutely beautiful. The Upanishads are a portion of the Vedas. This is some of the key texts that are associated with Hinduism and Eastern thought. Some of the older ones, at least in written form, go back like at least 2,600 years. And you can get collections pretty easily of the principal Upanishads. These are like 10 or 12 of these kind of philosophical texts that were sort of appendices to the Vedas themselves. And all they deal with is the fundamental nature of reality and how that relates to consciousness. The translation by Eknath Eswaran of principal Upanishads, as well as his translation of the Bhagavad Gita, which also gets into very philosophical consciousness-related territory. A lot of Westerners are not familiar with these texts. They are very fundamental. A person could spend lifetimes, I think, meditating on them.
I mean, we've been reading them for thousands of years, so there must be something to it, right?
And some of those materials, not necessarily in those forms, although they all do relate to a class of non-human intelligence that humans interrelate to. However you want to take that is up to the individual. But some classic Hindu texts, for instance, the Sri Shiva Rahasya, which is a key text in Shaivism, the worship of Shiva, or the celebration of Shiva, I should say. It begins with what sounds like a CE5 encounter. It's like sages getting together, meditating, and like a beam of light comes out through the clouds, a silver orb comes down. Like you're like, wow, this is how this like holy text starts. That's pretty interesting. And I don't have any firm conclusions about that. And I would encourage people not to come to firm conclusions. But again, if you kind of loosen your vision and you kind of just try to look for general patterns, I think what is useful is to see how people over the millennia have related notions of non-human intelligence, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of reality. And there's so much there for the mining. And I would love to see more people take advantage of those resources because they're beautiful and highly inspiring.
It's, I mean, first of all, great recommendations. And funnily enough, I started reading the Gita about a month ago, so it's very much I'm very just serendipitous. It's funny you say it, and for people that are not familiar, I think that the Bhagavad Gita also summarizes, I believe, a lot of the Upanishads, or a lot of the key takeaways, if you will. So I'm sure I'll be getting my feet wet in the original text themselves as well. And also, just for you to know, I'm actually half Indian myself.
That's awesome.
So I've spent most of my life avoiding the text that all my relatives have been trying to get me to read, and so I finally, ripped the Band-Aid off. And like you said, the parallels are very interesting. And
well, one thing I'll just say quickly is that like you can be non-religious and get something out of these materials. I mean, again, they're really works of philosophy at their core.
Indeed, indeed.
You can be a materialist, you can be a scientist. Many scientists are into these topics, and some have even been inspired for their research of the nature of reality or consciousness or whatever by such things. But I encourage people to just explore it. We're very Western-centric in the West, but we have such traditions globally that we can borrow from. And I think many of them are very illuminating if we put our time and energy into it, including indigenous group belief systems. I mean, people should be willing to put some of their time and energy into that type of stuff to dovetail their interest in UAP. I see them as being potentially highly compatible.
Agreed. Well, on that note, that brings us to the end of this conversation, and I just want to thank you one last time. And if you have anywhere, or what would be the best place to keep up with what you're working on besides DeclassifyUAP.com?
I'm pretty active on Twitter. My username is just @DeclassifyUAP, all one word. Same on Reddit. I'm just u/DeclassifyUAP, all one word. I've been again involved in online communities of interest around UAP for decades and decades. I love interacting with people. I'm a talker and I'm a listener, and I like engagement. I like kind of being in the trenches with folks. Again, maybe it's more of my kind of activist type of background. I want to be in the crowd and engaging with people. So you can certainly find me and talk to me on those platforms. DeclassifyUAP needs a few updates now, just because there's been some news and updates and new reports. So there will periodically be news updates there, and even just updates to some of the sections. But I'm pretty easy to get a hold of, and I thank you so much for highlighting the organization today, Mo. And again, Disclosure Diaries has been so inspiring to me. You're so on top of it. I felt I don't need to hold the gas down quite so hard on those weekly update kind of things, because you're just kicking ass at it, frankly. And
Appreciate it.
Between what you've done and what Lester's done with UAP Caucus and Declassify UAP and some other efforts, there's the Disclosure Party on Reddit. There's a few others. Again, there's this bubbling up of this kind of grassroots engagement aspect of the UAP issue that's certainly new to my lifetime. And I think we're at the very beginning of that. Again, I think we all have to be willing to play the long game. But the fact that we all are communicating and we're working with one another and we're kind of collaborating and taking this kind of compatible view, I've noticed that some of the older heads in the UAP scene, folks that I would be know one another and work together behind the scenes, I've often found that they don't. And I think there's something about maybe the fact that we came up in the internet era or whatever. We're all really willing to kind of work with one another and create consortiums of people. And I think that's the way that this is going to get to the end zone, to keep the football metaphor going. We've got to work together. We've got to be willing to be believer and skeptic, elbow in elbow, and just try to figure out what the hell is going on. So much time and energy is wasted on battling one another when we really don't have enough information at this point to put that much energy into battles and being so firm in our beliefs about things. I think we all need to be really open-minded, collaborative, balance one another, take this holistic approach. And I see it happening, and it gives me a lot of confidence that we're going to see quite a lot, not just through the end of 23, but into 2024. I think we're going to see some marked progress.
I'm with you on that. An optimist at the very least. All right. Again, thank you, Nick.
Thank you, sir.
I'm sure we'll be in touch, and I look forward to seeing what the future holds in terms of all things Declassify UAP.
It's been a real pleasure, Mo. Have a great one.